At Vinton County National Bank, we believe in supporting the areas where we live and work. Now, we'd like to honor those who also serve our communities. Our new Community Champions account is especially for first responders, veterans, active military, and anyone employed in the fields of healthcare or education. This account offers rewards, discounts, and other benefits to those who give so much to others. Vinton County National Bank, rewarding those who serve.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to the morning show right here on Main Street TV, where we are here this morning with a very, very special guest. And we're so excited to talk to Dr. Todd Reynolds. And Dr. Todd Reynolds is, of course, a Jackson native. And many of you may know him or say, hey, I know that fella. I grew up with him. But you have written a book, and we're going to chat about that today. So welcome.
Thank you very much. Looking forward to it.
Yes, and this is so exciting because I've always just been curious about World War II, and unfortunately, our World War II veterans are passing every day. There's very few left, and those stories that they could tell along the way, unfortunately, go with them. And but you have done a little bit. For your family and preserving the legacy and some of the things of your parents during World War II. I think that's so cool. Could you tell us about it?
Sure, I'd be glad to. The background of this whole thing was I am one of three brothers, as you may or may not know. I have an older brother, Jeff, and a younger brother that goes apparently by several different names, either Jim or Gordon or whatever.
It's Mr.
And
Reynolds.
I'm the middle. Yeah, yeah. Well,
If he
true.
was your
And
principal and you were sucking up, it's Mr. Reynolds. It's still Mr. Reynolds to
Yeah,
me.
okay. Yeah, that's true. He was that was one of the stops he made. Um, anyway, our parents passed away several years ago, and by the time they passed away, we had all moved on, the three of us, and so we had to basically decide what we wanted to do with the house and belongings and all the kind of things you do.
Yeah.
Um, and some of it we donated and some of it we kept and on and on. And one of the things that I kept was a scrapbook of my mother and a bundle of letters that my dad and mom exchanged with each other during the war years. And It just occurred to me that might be an interesting there might be an interesting story in all of that. So I decided then, this was several years ago, that at some point I'd try to read through all of those letters and see if there was anything there. And then obviously got involved in all kind of different things with life and jobs and everything else. Um, and so it wasn't until recently, a few years ago, 2 or 3 years ago, that I was clearing out a storage locker I have here in Illinois. Uh, and came across these letters again. And by that time, those letters are nearly 70 years old and they're starting
Wow.
to crinkle and turn to dust. And so I think, well, maybe it's now or never. So that's when it all began. And so I wanted to read through them and see what was what, and I did. And then it began to realize that the story of our parents, Gordy and Liza, um, probably was a story that was similar to you know, everybody in the country in the 40s, and that what was going on in Jackson was probably not unlike what was going on in small towns and large towns and farm areas, across the country as well. So it seemed like there might be something there. So, but with the focus being on our parents and then their interactions, both at home, and dad was away, and whether it was boot camp or he wound up eventually in Italy, and mom was pretty much in charge of of running the household and handling things on the home front. And so that's essentially what the story is all about. Their relationship between basically 1941 and when Dad returned home in 1946, um, and how that all played out over those years, and dealing with the war, both on the home front and then from the military point of view, where Dad's service took him. So that's the point of the book, I guess.
Well, it's wonderful. Number one, that they have had preserved those letters and saved them, because again, it's part of your family history. Can you talk a little bit as we back up, maybe about your childhood in Jackson and where you got to be where you are today?
Sure, sure. Uh, born in, well, not born in Jackson, born in Columbus, I believe, but from Jackson in November of 1943. So I'm guessing I would be a war baby, so to
Ye-
speak.
Sounds that way.
And yeah, and lived all of my early childhood life in Jackson, uh, involved in all kind of things within the community. The uh, grew up there, and neighborhood kids running around and being goofy and all kind of things. And um, the three of us were involved in athletics at the high school and involved in some other things at the high school, and pretty normal kind of growing up, I guess. Summer jobs, delivered papers, baled hay in the summer. Used
Oh.
to work for Bug Doug France and ice cream shops and all kind of things. Uh, but then, fortunately, all three of us, I guess, were maybe slightly above average in our athletic abilities, and we all wound up going off to school, different schools, and playing various sports at the schools we went to. Uh, I majored in history and political science with the idea of being interested in education, and graduated eventually from Eastern Kentucky University, um, with a degree in history and political science, and in 65, 1965, a long time ago.
Few
And
years ago is what we say here.
a few, yeah, and that's where it all began. I started there and as a history teacher, and was an assistant football coach for a year or two, and then went back to school to get a master's degree also in history, and then did that, and then eventually, once that was completed, um, there was another Jackson connection that I followed. A person by the name of Jerry Walk, who was the academic dean. Jerry was a sort of a standout football player and whatever at Urbana University, Urbana College back then, in Urbana, Ohio.
Hmm.
And I now had a master's degree and thought I was, know everything there was to know, and found out that I didn't know everything I needed to know for anything else. But anyway, contacted Jerry and wound up at Urbana, um, teaching history and living in a residence hall, and was sort of involved in sort of the residence life aspect of all of that. Stayed
Makes
there
sense.
for 10 years, teaching and sort of doing the administrative thing. And uh, then, as it turns out, there were some political changes. The president changed, and there was some shakeup at Urbana. So I was looking for someplace else to go. Wound up in Kansas, at
Oh.
another school, Marymount College, in Salina, Kansas. as their dean of students and still teaching. Um, that school eventually closed uh, and eventually was bought out apparently by K State, but for a while it was just a shell of empty buildings and whatever. So started looking for gainful employment somewhere else and made my way back to Illinois, a place called Marymount or McKendree College, and I stayed at McKendree for 25 years,
Oh,
history
wow.
teaching and vice vice president for student affairs, and eventually wound up. The school went through a transition from the NAIA to the NCAA Division II, and I was the athletic director for a little while there as well. And
Cool.
then in 2012, um, I retired from McKendree. That retirement at the end of 2012 in May was my last day at McKendree, but by I suppose June or July, I decided that retirement was not working for me. So I
As so many
retired from
people do.
retirement. Yeah, so I retired from retirement and have been adjunct teaching ever since. And as I've mentioned in some of the information I provided, um, during the course of my sort of career, I've traveled over 5 or 6 different states and half a dozen different schools and different kind of positions, both administrative and education and or in teaching, and found myself in different places along the way. Um, Not only at the schools, but sometimes at some of their branches. Urbana had a branch at London Correctional Institution, so I taught in a prison up there for a couple of years,
Oh, interesting.
and just different kind of things that people do. It's not quite like being in the military, but it is a transient world, and so that's my story. Teaching and administrative work, and um, still teaching. I actually have classes starting. I'm teaching now currently an adjunct uh, at a community college not too far from where I am in O'Fallon, but it's in Belleville. It's Southwestern Illinois College, and classes start next week, as a matter of fact. So I've got 2 classes down there, and that's plenty for me at the moment. But so still teaching. I was
Good.
thinking to myself the other day, since the fall of 1965, I have been in a classroom every fall. I don't know how many years that is, but it's
A
beginning
few.
to be ridiculous. Yeah, be ridiculous. So at some point, I've got to officially retire, I guess. But I might have another year or so in me. But so that's my story from Eastern Kentucky, and while I was at Urbana, I started a doctoral program at Ohio State and eventually finished that. Also in history and whatever. So I have a doctoral degree from the Ohio State University,
Woohoo.
and so yeah, exactly. But anyway, so those are my degrees and my stops along the way, and a little bit about where I came from, and uh, but life in Jackson, was I have no complaints about that. There's
Right.
a lot of people, and myself included. I was one of those that complain about life in a small town, and nothing goes on, and it's all busybody work and everything else. And I was probably guilty of some of that myself, but I thought Jackson prepared me well for all of that. The school system and the friendly nature of the place, and the supportive nature of the community, and all of that kind of thing. As I mentioned, Jeff and I, in particular, uh, have not spent a lot of time in Jackson since we left after high school. Jim, of course, is sort of a lifelong resident there.
Yeah.
Um, but when you consider the the background, the friends, and the stories and the memories and whatever, Jackson will always be home
Right.
for us. Even though we don't get back there that much, it's still home. So
You
there
know,
you have it.
and a lot of people will knock, growing up in a small town, but I think, and you mentioned it, just the kindness of folks. And maybe everybody tries to get in everybody's business, but the fact of the matter is small communities stick together and they help each other out. And there is a lot of kindness and friendliness that you don't see
Yes.
in some of the big cities. I'm sure you've seen that in your travels as well.
Well, we have, and I never have really lived in a like a giant city. This place I live in now is just outside of, it's across the river in Illinois, but it's just outside of St. Louis. And
Uh-huh.
St. Louis is not exactly a huge city, but it's bigger than Jackson,
Yes.
and so it's about as close. And when we lived in Kansas, when I lived in Kansas. Um, that lived in Salina, and Salina was maybe 50 or 1,000 or 60,000 or something like that. But that's about as big as city as I have lived in. I have lived close to large cities, Kansas City, and been to several large cities for different kinds of things. But there's something about a small town that is just fine with me.
Yeah, no doubt, no doubt. Yeah, the big city, the culture is just a bit different. I know you go
Yeah.
up to, say, Columbus, for example, and you walk down the street and you pass someone and you say hi and they look at you like they're gonna stab you or you're gonna stab them or something. So it's
Well,
just a cultural difference, and that's totally fine. So let's get back to the book for a moment. And of course, the book is
right.
called Gordy and Liza. And you literally had these letters. Did you know these letters existed before your parents passed?
Not really. One of the things that we had in the house where we all lived on Church Street was there was a dresser upstairs, um, in one of the bedrooms, I think, that in addition to having clothes in it, also had one of the drawers was full of sort of the military memorabilia and whatever, the badges and the patches and the ribbons and the few medals that Dad won and whatever, and a few things that he brought back with him. And in there, somewhere in all of that, was this scrapbook. And
Wow.
so we knew it was there, or I knew it was there. And there was also another large book, which I guess maybe you don't see so much today, but sort of the family Bible that had all
Oh,
kind of information that went back generations and notes and all kind of things in it that Jeff has. Jeff actually had most of this stuff, and and in addition to the scrapbook, there was um, bundles of letters, and I didn't have any idea those things existed.
that is so
A
cool.
lot of those Yeah, a lot of those letters were letters that my mother had written. I mean, most of what's in the scrapbook are letters that she received from our dad, um, and I don't know what the ratio is. Haven't tried to figure it out, but I would guess it's maybe one out of every 10 letters is a letter from that she wrote. Um, and the way that they wound up there, some of those letters had never been opened because they had been sent to wherever he was, and uh, he had moved on, and
Aha.
the military just sent him back. Um, and he had mentioned that to her in several of his letters to her, that don't need to try to write me. I'm going to be gone. The unit he was in is on the move, and we're scheduled to leave here within 24 hours or something. So the address you have is not where I'm going to be, and they'll send you the letter back. Sometimes he's at some place and he's going to be there for several weeks, and so they could get letters there. But anyway, a lot of these letters that were bound up just with strings and whatever, probably in groups of 25 or 30 letters, um, with big stamps on them saying return to sender, really, and not deliverable, or some sort of postage notification on it. So I looked in all of those as well. But yeah, there may have been, I haven't really done a count, but a few hundred letters that I've
Wow.
had that they've exchanged, and I've read through most of them, I guess.
So what did you maybe learn about your parents through these letters that you didn't know, or were there any surprises?
Well, not really surprises in in terms. A lot of the information was information about what was going on in Jackson, um, and I guess one of the obvious things that occurred to me was how strong their relationship was.
Mhm.
Now they were married in 1938 or 39, I think. So when the war started, and at least for the American aspect of the war in 41, after the bombing of Pearl Harbor, they've only been married 2 or 3, 4 years. So
Wow.
I suppose they're still newlyweds in something. So that might account
Sure.
for a little bit of the affection that's in these letters, because these letters were interesting. I mean, in some ways they were love letters. Um, and in other ways, it was mom telling him what was going on in Jackson, and other families that they knew, that their husbands or some member of their family was somewhere else in the service, and also what was going on with the the projects that were happening in Jackson on sort of the home front, blood drives and scrap paper drives and scrap metal drives, and all the new different kind of things that were going on. Um, and and then there was also the military stuff, particularly from Dad. He was a private in the Army, and wound up doing all the KP duty and latrine duty, and so he wasn't sure that the Army life was what he really wanted. But eventually, most of it was, the relationship between them, and how strong that was. So that would be one thing. And then the other thing that occurred to me was um, how how they seemed to be sort of on the same page of a lot of things. The situation that we lived in Jackson was a multi generational house. There were the two of us, and then eventually Jim was born after the war, um, and our parents, and then my mother's parents. So we had grandparents, parents, and kids all
Oh.
living together. I don't guess that multi generational houses were all that um, uh, unique at that time. A lot of folks that we knew, kids that we knew, were in that same kind of situation. So um, I particularly uh, I particularly appreciate, the role that mom had, because she was taking care of, some aging parents and two little brat kids running around, Jeff and I, and then dealing with the house. I know during the course of the years, those years, the furnace had to be replaced, and there were some other just normal kind of house things. And she would sometimes write to Dad and say, I don't know what to do. The furnace is clacking and banging, and he would give her, well, you need to call, somebody, Pat Hackett or somebody else, to come and take a look at that furnace, and eventually had to get it replaced. And so there was all that going on as well, as opposed to, just where the war was, and where he was in the war and what he was doing, and traveling around from military base to military base before he was eventually sent off to Italy. So
So
all of that was going on in those letters.
Yeah, and I think that, kind of was the common story, although the story that you're telling is your own story, and very, very memorable and meaningful to you, and hopefully to everybody that reads the book. But the story, I don't want to say was the same, but a common thread was, of course, the women were stuck here, raising families, and even having to go to work and things like that, when men had to go to war, whether they volunteered or were volunteered.
Absolutely.
um, so what did you make of that? And like, what did she say anything about, how other women were feeling, or friends or anything? Or was it just like, we're just
Oh
trying to
yeah.
concentrate on our family and make sure that they're all taken care of? Were there support
Uh,
groups? Was there anything like that
yes.
you know of?
The answer to that is yes and yes. They did talk about the sort of the immediate family and relatives and all of that sort of thing. But yeah, there were support groups. Uh, they I don't know what they would call the wives of the troops or whatever, but uh, they seemed to like they were always had sort of an agenda and a cohesion themselves, dealing with common problems and whatever. And unfortunately, some of the some of the news that was coming back from the battlefields wasn't always good, and so
Yes.
she would comment about the fact that the 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 church we attended was the Presbyterian church there in Jackson, um, and they had been members of something called the Builders class. Um, but the church had did provide sometimes prayer vigils for fallen soldiers and whatever, and wives would get together and talk about pretty much what their experiences were and what their anxieties were, how they were feeling. Some of the some of the clubs in town, I suppose they are service clubs, social clubs. The Elks uh, continually had, it seemed to me, like recreational kind of thing, card parties and different kind of things. At least get the women together, the wives together, and
Wow.
then they did that on their own. Um, and they were involved in different aspects of the home front. They were involved in overseeing the ration books, coupons, and all of that, and they would organize blood drives, and they would do all different kind of things. So yeah, there was this sub community, I guess, a
Yep.
subset of a community uh, made up of principally women, and many of them had husbands off somewhere, and I'm sure they seem to be um, supportive of each other. That was one of the very obvious themes that those are the kind of things that mom would refer to in the letter she would write to dad wherever he might be, that these are the kind of things that we're doing now. And she taught at the time, and the teachers had been used, I guess, by the city administration to sort of oversee the administration of the ration books.
Oh,
The notations and the distribution of those things, and the sort of the record keepings and all that kind of stuff. So, and most of that was done by females as well. So yeah, I wouldn't say that the entirety of the home front was done by women, but they certainly played maybe even a majority role of what was happening on the home front, and supporting each other and raising each other's kids, doing all kind of things like that. So yeah,
sure.
absolutely.
And I was just sitting here thinking, it had to have been terribly difficult for the men to go to war and be away from their families and whatever. But the women back here were also had to sit in constant fear that they were going to have someone show up at their door, or that letter was not going to come, and that their husband or father or somebody was not coming home. And I mean, you would have to just think about that all of the time. And that had to be a lot
Well,
of stress on them.
yeah, the air was, and it was more that whole military thing and all the things you mentioned, the ramifications of it was more than the elephant in the room. It was just a constant
Yes.
interruption of sort of regular routines, I guess, in one's life and all of that. And the city, I must say, uh, was very supportive as well. Where the courthouse is now, and well, I haven't been back, so I don't know if it's still looks like it did, you know, 40 years ago when I was back there.
Pretty
Um,
much.
but there used to be, yeah, there used to be a sort of a large lawn space where I think they had a cannon or something in it. But
Yes.
well, at any rate, during the war years, they put up a gigantic bulletin board, um, and uh, and on that board, they basically it was a tribute to all the Jackson County, and I don't know if it was just Jackson or local counties or whatever, but Jackson in particular, of all the service folks that were wherever they were, their rank, and it was just like column after column after column after column,
Yes.
um, uh, and uh, and then the newspaper uh, also would run a regular feature, depending upon regular was irregular because you didn't always get information on a regular basis, but uh, they were particularly supportive of those that were either killed in action or missing in action, and they would run a feature in the newspaper
Oh,
with their pictures and the last assignment and what the current knowledge is about them, and in some cases they were announced them as they were been killed at whatever in whatever battle it might have been or location, and others were prisoners of war or uh, missing in action. But it was a recognition of all of the outcomes, I guess, of the not so pleasant sides
yes.
of military life, and I was I was very much impressed with how the Jackson community really came together. And all the kind of things that they did. From some of it was influenced by national decisions and state decisions, and they ran blackout drills and they did all different kind of things. But they were very much involved in doing all of that, and it just seemed like you didn't hear much about complaining about it. I mean, everybody.
Correct.
Uh, it was just it was just an expectation at the time, and it seemed to me that Jackson did its part quite well,
I
actually.
think that's why it can be argued, of course, that the World War II generation was the best generation. I've heard that numerous times over, my years here on this planet. And when you hear stories like this, you kind of, as you understand that your parents lived it, you understand why people would say that. And so what when people pick up your book, and I think we do have a picture of the book there, and it can be purchased on Amazon, is that correct?
That is correct. Yes.
Okay, there it is. Gordy and Liza. So as people pick up that book, What what should they expect that they're going to read about and hear about the most?
I think the early part of the book, the first chapter or so, talks a lot about Jackson and
Oh,
not so much my background or whatever, but Jackson and preparations, or how it was initially impacted by the war along with everybody else, and but how Jackson responded to it and marshaled, human resources and all of that sort of thing. And then sort of woven into that is a little bit about what were Gordy and Liza doing this during that time
Okay.
before before the bombing of Pearl Harbor and all of that. Uh, so that would be the first thing, and then it follows a sequence of uh, Dad and the war after Pearl Harbor. Uh, I would say within a matter of a few months, and he wasn't the only one. There was obviously an enormous rush to enlist or get
Yes.
drafted or whatever it might be. Well, he initially was enlisted in the Navy Reserve. He was in the naval forces and was eventually wound up at Norfolk, Virginia. I think he would be what might commonly be referred to as the CBs. Um, but that was a very short tenure. I mean, it was literally a matter of months, and then he was medically discharged because of a back problem.
Okay.
And then there was this period of time where um, they were going about their lives, dealing with the war and everything else. Um, and eventually, however, he was drafted into the army,
Aha.
and so he went to Fort Thomas, Kentucky, where he was inducted, and then from there to on to Fort Sill in Oklahoma, and bounced back between Fort Sill and Fort Bragg, and eventually during the prior to the war and during that whatever it was, couple of months between the naval service and the army service, uh, he had a few different jobs. One of which was he was on a survey crew for the state of Ohio, highway construction and all of that, and
Okay.
understood instruments and all of that craziness that I never understood. Um, and he also had a work experience with Eddie Clare Brothers, and Eddie Clare had a men's shop, Clare Brothers Men's Shop, up on Main Street. So he worked there a little while. So he did a few things, but mostly worked for the state of Ohio. So he had some experiences in the world of work, and uh, military recruiters. And when he wound up on these bases, as they're looking over different kind of things, they notice that he has these kind of experiences, and so
Sure.
he eventually became um head of a observation unit that their role was the ones that were sort of close to the front lines. Um, Eventually, when they made it into full combat, um, close to the front lines, and they're the ones that are giving the pilots and the um, guys that are shooting the big artillery guns, the coordinates of where they need to aim the targets, and we're off by this much, and so recalibrate your calculations and whatever. So he was in charge of a team that was was doing that kind of thing, and then eventually wound up teaching that at some of these bases
Oh.
because he had these experiences. So what I would want what I would want people to take away from this is that, as you mentioned, that I think their story is not unlike literally thousands of other stories, um, but it is a story about them, and it is a story about Jackson.
Yeah.
So, uh, so to that extent, uh, it is a it is an example as I mentioned somewhere, I don't know where I actually said this, but if you ever if you ever wanted to put a definition on patriotism or see what it looked like in action, um, just somehow get in a time machine and come back to Jackson, Ohio in the 1940s, and
Sure.
you would see it at in work and practice and whatever. And I think that you mentioned it earlier. This generation, the greatest generation, as it's sometimes called,
Yep.
um, felt felt that service was something that was expected as part of your citizenship. Um, they
They were proud.
they did, yeah, they did, issue, complain about, as I said, Dad complained about latrine duty and KP duty and all different kind of things, uh, but I think neither one of them were ever upset about the fact that what they were doing was not important or even a requirement
Yes.
of citizenship. And one of the things that I found to be rather amazing was that when the war was over and everybody was back, um, and maybe this is just true of the sort of the military mindset in general, but there were rare conversations about the war. They didn't
Oh.
talk about it. Even in now, what they did when they were former troops that were there and down at the Elks or someplace, having a beer or something, they might have talked 1,000 war stories, but in general, it wasn't a topic that was talked about much, or examples, or and there were several people that were in the war uh, that we became. They were friends of the family. The uh, Our family dentist, Dr. Shoemate, was in the war, and he was by the house several times. Tom Davis was in the war. John Giroy, the barber, all those guys and many more uh, were all in the war, not necessarily together, but in the war. And whenever they would stop by or we'd run into them over the years, very rarely, if ever, did anything about their war experience ever come out. And I think
Hmm.
my best assessment of that is they didn't really feel the need to talk about the war. They thought history would do all the talking that they ever wanted to talk and about and all of that. So that would be another message I would think about what patriotism looked like, uh, the sacrifice that was on everybody. The
It was.
few and far between, I would guess, of individuals that sort of avoided not necessarily service, but uh, being touched by this war and how people responded, and particularly in this town. Uh, I think it's as much a history in some ways of Jackson's preparation and response to the war and all of that as it is about Gordy and Liza. That was more of
Yeah.
a personal history and whatever. So
Well, what a great combination of all of the things into one book. So thank you for taking the time to do all of that. And I wonder if I'm sitting here thinking about like the technology that we have today, whether it was, whether it's the internet, which obviously didn't exist in 1942, and emails and fax machines and all of the things that, have come along since then. And the fact that the only communication that they really had was writing a physical letter, putting it in the mail, and praying it got to where it was going. And the fact that
pretty much.
things actually got where they were going, that's insane to
Yeah,
me.
that's well, yeah, it's insane to me too because one of the things that also stands out is that these two, and I'm sure it's true of everybody else, wrote a lot of letters,
Yes.
and sometimes more than one letter a day. Morning, or you'd get a letter. I remember in the letters the dad would have, he would talk about, well, I got your letter from whenever it was, 2 days ago or 3 days ago, and so you responded to that. And then the next day or later that day, he would begin the letter and say, "Oh, I forgot to mention something in the letter I wrote this morning," and whatever.
Wow.
Uh, and and how quick it came. It occurred to me
Right.
that the mail back then moved faster than the mail does today.
I
Because
was going to ask you that question. How long did it take for a letter
well,
to
it
get from Italy to here?
well, it's amazingly short. I mean, a matter of days, as opposed,
Wow.
and he was writing letters uh, on the ship that he took from out of the sort of the Virginia area, the port in Virginia, to Naples, Italy, is where he eventually wound up. Um, and he was writing letters on board that ship. And so I guess they had some way to pick up letters, and because he would talk about, second day at sea, and uh, this is a very big ocean, and
I'll bet.
occasionally they'd see other ships passing them that were either troops coming back or another ship that was headed somewhere into the European theater or on. Um, and and But by and large, it was they would get letters off of the pick up mail off of the ship and deliver, because some of the
That's
letters would
crazy.
talk about, it was probably 2 weeks maybe, or 3 weeks take to get from the United States to the Mediterranean and beyond. And and he would get letters on the ship as he was sailing across the
Wow.
Atlantic. And so I don't know how they were doing all of that, but it was another pretty amazing thing. The One of the other things that was very troublesome to them both uh, was Dad was in Italy when Germany finally surrendered. So one of the other aspects of that book is that there is a little bit of a military history in it all,
Okay.
and what was going
That's
on,
great.
and the German defenses and their defensive lines and all different kinds of things, and what was going on sort of simultaneous with that in the Pacific, in the that theater of the war. But one of the things that was very troublesome to him was that um, as the war was coming to an end in Europe, and Dad was in Italy, and was there um, when Germany eventually surrendered on VE Day,
Mhm.
and then it was a matter of him just sort of, what happens now.
Right.
Well, what happens now is that the war in the Pacific is still going on, and it's getting bloodier and more fierce and all kind of things all along the way. And what was happening is that a lot of the troops, not all, but a lot of the troops that were involved in the European theater are now being deployed directly out of the European theater to the Pacific theater.
Oh,
And so for them,
my.
the war in Europe is over, but now they're going to get thrown into the war in the Pacific or something. And that didn't happen to everybody. And in some cases, they were going to bring troops back from Europe and then sort of orient them to a different kind of war that was going on in the Pacific, island hopping and all kind of things like that, uh, and uh, and then send them over there. So
Wow.
Dad wasn't sure if he was done with war yet or not, and I do remember that one of the letters that Mom wrote, she wrote to, I can't remember his name now, but one of the congressmen that in the U.S. Congress, uh, because there seemed to be all kind of confusion about who was going to be re-sent to the Pacific and whatever. Oh, and she just unloaded on this guy about you. I don't want you even thinking about sending Gordy Reynolds to the Pacific. He's done his thing. He needs to come home. We need to have him back here. And the
Yes.
guy wrote him back. Well, as it turns out, uh, the decision had been made uh, by Truman to drop the bombs on Japan, and and so that possibility never really
Sure.
was other than was reality, because by the time he got back to the United States, it was only a matter of days after that uh, Japan surrendered. So he never
Gotcha.
was obviously sent back to war in the Pacific. So, but there those kind of things that were going on within the military apparatus and the government, and they had a point system as to who was going to get out. How many, what your age was, if you had how many years in service, how many
Oh,
um, direct combat missions, battles you were actually involved in, how many kids you had, on and on and on and on and on. You get certain points for all of those,
okay.
and if you had if you had a certain number of points, which meant that you were had done all of those things or lots of those things, uh, you were then brought back and most likely were going to be discharged from the military. But if you were below those, you most likely would have additional military service. So as it turns out, Dad was right on that line and could have gone either way. And
Oh
so
my.
Mom had written the congressman and basically told him, you have no business sending him to Japan, and and that didn't ever happen because by the time he got back, the war in Japan had pretty much come to an end.
Wow.
So you have all of that, what was going on in the surrender of both, and Hitler's Hitler's demands, and how he changed and altered the battlefield in Italy and all different kind of things to try and keep the Allied powers from opening up another front that he was having a hard time dealing with, and what was happening in Japan, and the significance of some of the islands that were eventually conquered um, uh, by the Allied forces, and how that was all part of a bigger military strategy. Well, that's all covered in that book as well. So
Wonderful. And it's not a wonderful situation. It's wonderful you were able to have this history and to be able to document it within your book and tie your family situation into it. But and you just think about not having news crews there and all of this technology that we have today. It just blows my mind that anybody knew anything back
yeah,
then and
yeah,
how things were going.
yeah. It's really amazing, and I remember going to movies at the Marquet Theater there
Yes.
in Jackson, uh, and during and after the war, and the Cold War had started by that time, and so uh, they'd have these little snippet newsreels that somehow had been taken like weeks and weeks and weeks ahead of time, and now Allied troops are moving on to this, that, and the other, and everything else. So yeah, you wonder about. Well, they say that it wasn't until the Vietnam War that the real time battlefield scenes were
Yes.
brought into the living rooms of families. So all of it was sort of after the fact, but it didn't diminish the realities of the war. It just meant it wasn't quite as instant as the military is and the and news today. whether it's military or anything else.
Well,
It happens somewhere, and while the smoke is still cleaning, it's on television sets all over the world. So
I think sometimes we're overnewsed today, if I can use that as a word, because
it's a good word. It's a good word.
it's it's just a lot today, and it's just overload of information that we may or may not need to know. So well, we have a couple of minutes here. What would you like to tell our viewers, that you hope that they glean from the book, or anything that you would like to tell them before we let you get out of here for the morning?
Well, probably a little bit of a rehash of the kind of things we've talked about. I'd like for them to, particularly if they're Jackson residents or that whole region of
Yes.
southeastern Ohio, uh, to understand and appreciate the effort that was made by not only the troops or the soldiers, but just the residents of those communities and towns, and the important role they played in terms of supporting the troops that were off in harm's way and whatever, and supporting each other at home,
Yes.
um, and the degree of things that were going on. There are some pictures in the book itself that were taken from the Jackson newspapers, uh,
Oh, cool.
of metal scrap drives and all different kind of that farmers, the call went out, if you got busted plows or anything else, bring it to a certain location and we'll just stack it. Well, these things were like giant. I mean, tons and tons and tons of broken up farm equipment, and cars that didn't run anymore, uh,
Wow.
and all of that was coordinated by local folks within Jackson or Jackson County or whatever, because there were these location spots in Jackson, Wellston, and Oak Hill were the three areas that generally, when they did something of that magnitude, those were the three drop-off spots. So I'd like for people to understand, the tremendous effort that was undertaken by the residents of Jackson, in addition to those that went in off to war. Uh, I would like for them to have a little bit of a a little bit of a better understanding of maybe what the war was like on a personal level,
Sure.
at least between two people that were sort of caught up in it. Um, and again, I don't know that their story is wholly different than stories of maybe hundreds of others, but the idea is that was the point of it. It's the common experience that war had on
Yes.
folks that maybe um, and how it affected it, and all of that. And then there's sort of just the general military history for anybody that has interest in, and it's not an absolute covering of World War II, but there are some military aspects to the book that talk about various campaigns and battles in the Apennines Mountains and in Italy, and um, what was going on in the islands of the Pacific with the Japanese troops, and why the Japanese, um, were so committed to the war, and
Yes.
and refused to surrender, and all the kind of things. So there's that element of it too, and so I think those are the kind of things that I would mention. I would also uh, mention the fact that in addition to the materials that I had, which was basically bundles of letters and scrapbooks and whatever, um, I was able to get some material, not me alone, but at all, but Jim, my brother Jim, or Gordon,
Yeah.
or however he was
Mr.
referred to
Reynolds.
back there. Mr. Reynolds these days, uh, uh, dug up a lot of stuff out of the archives at the Jackson Library,
Cool.
old newspaper clippings and other kind of things, uh, and sent those things, made copies of them and sent them off to me. And so a lot of those things, or some of those things, are included in the book itself. Jeff had a lot of uh, memories about that time. Jeff was, I didn't know much about. I don't have any real vivid memories, but Jeff does. Jeff was 4 or 5 years old during this whole period of time, and he can remember pulling a red wagon through the streets, alleys of Jackson, picking up tin cans and doing all kind of things, and um,
Okay.
going with mom to the grocery with her coupon books and all. I don't remember any of that, but Jeff does. So he was able to share a lot of those memories with me. The the state of Ohio Department of Veterans Affairs was able to dig up uh, military records of Gordy Reynolds.
Hmm.
So I had some of that information as well. And then I had a friend of mine, uh, a lady by the name of Damarise Patterson, um, who who actually laid out the whole book. I wrote the thing, and she is from she's from Switzerland, um, right on the Italian border. So uh, when I was talking to her one day about the book, and because a lot of the um, information and the history of the dad's experience in Italy was in the northern part of Italy, which was close to the Swiss Alps and the um, Italian Alps and all over the place. Well, she knew all about all those areas up there because that's where she lived. Um, and she was also a mastermind at computers and all of that. So she scanned the pictures and the documents and the letters and all kind of things, and then placed them in the books and did all that. She designed the cover of the thing, and when it eventually was sent off to the publisher, there was got a note back from them and said that they really didn't need to do anything else, um,
That's great.
because it was done so incredibly well and whatever. So she was of great assistance as well. So uh, it's a book that that I'm glad I wrote. I wanted something to commemorate in honor of our parents, for family and whatever, for grandkids and their grandkids and whatever. And that was the original intent, I suppose. But then as I got to thinking about it, well, this is a common story, and Jackson is a common town that uh,
Yep.
was a history that could be replicated time and time and time and time again. So anyway, it's out there for anybody who wants to pick it up.
Okay.
It's go to Amazon and Google in the title, and it'll take you to the book, and ordering information and everything else will be included at that point. So
Heck yeah. All right. Well, Dr. Todd Reynolds, we thank you so much for spending your morning with us. What a wealth of information. And we're so proud of you for writing this book. And we also want to thank you for sharing your family's story with us. And you can pick that up on Amazon, Gordy and Liza, Gordie and Liza, and check it out. So thank you for spending time with us this morning, and best of luck to you.
well, thank you very much, and I hope the people of Jackson would enjoy it. That was also part of the audience that I was hoping to reach. So
I think they will. Think they will. Well, have a great
okay,
day, and we'll see you soon.
all right, thank you very much, and
Thanks.
enjoyed it.
All right. And
Bye.
thank you all for tuning in this morning. We greatly appreciate it. And we'll be right back here tomorrow. So we'll see you then. Thanks for watching. Bye bye.
Bye.